So thanks a lot for the organizer for inviting me to present today, and for Joanna for setting the scene so well. So I'm going to be talking about the impact of aging on the economy kind of broadly. So I'm going to start by just talking about how do economists think about age and therefore aging in the population. And it's basically this workforce theory of the economic life cycle. Very simply, we think of the young cohorts as being high labor income and low wealth, and then the older cohorts as being high wealth and lower labor income. And so here I'm showing data for the UK from the Wealth and Asset Survey, taking averages across households and averages across years to give a kind of illustrative sense of exactly this economic life cycle. And what we can see is, as you'd sort of expect, as these households become kind of economically active at around, let's say, 15 or age 15 or 20, they enter the they enter the economy with a kind of low medium labor income. Their labor income increases into middle age, and that's when they are very kind of highly productive and supplying a lot of labor. And then that labor income drops off as they reach roughly the retirement age 60 or 65. In order to sort of what we would say smooth consumption over that lifetime in the face of this hump-shaped path of income, what do those agents have to do? They have to save. And so that's where you see this kind of net wealth pattern of households entering with low or even zero wealth, building up their wealth through their working age and reaching this kind of high wealth stage of life, again, around middle age and into retirement. And then once they're in retirement, you can see this kind of slow dissaving out of net wealth as they use that wealth to finance their consumption in retirement. One of the things we notice here, so relative to this kind of very simple model of thinking about wealth as a vehicle of savings to finance retirement, one of the things you'll notice is that actually in the data, the dissaving out of wealth in retirement is actually relatively slow. So actually, even into age 75, 80, what we see is that households tend to retain quite a high level of wealth. And so that leads to the first kind of poll question of the day, which is what do kind of the audience members think drives that slow pace of this saving during retirement? And kind of come back to the answer to this question towards the end of the presentation. So I've given a couple of potential suggestions, like to leave inheritance or precaution against kind of unexpected expenditure for medical or care expenses, potentially just behavioral kind of rule of thumb saving and or like love of wealth or desire to hold wealth, or potentially some kind of composition effect that we observe higher wealth individuals live longer, and therefore what we measure as the average wealth of higher older households is higher, or potentially others that do pesky come offers as well. And we'll come back to this, the answers to this at the end of my presentation. So what I'm going to do is just very kind of broadly think about these two facts, this idea of the young being having high labor and the old having high wealth, and think about what that means on aggregate. So what I'm going to do, starting from the labor income side, is basically take this labor income profile as fixed and then use the population shares that we observe over time. So exactly the data that Joanna was presenting and these kind of population pyramids or population rectangles, to think year by year, if we aggregate our labor income, what does that do to aggregate labor? And so I'm going to be interpreting this measure of labor income as essentially effective units of labor. So a combination of the hours that each individual is working and how productive they are per hour. And so if I do that and get this kind of synthetic measure of effective labor, again, this is using for the UK, kind of population data for the UK, you get this synthetic measure of the effective units of labor here shown year-on-year growth, and then the dashed lines are the kind of projections from the UN for what's going to happen to the population. And what you can see here is basically a pattern where you can see the baby boom. So in around the 1970s, when the baby boom generations are entering the workforce around age 20, you can see this pickup in the effective units of labor on aggregate in the economy. And as they gain productivity and they start to supply more labor and reach their middle age, that creates this kind of increase in effective units of labor throughout the kind of 90s and early 2000s. Around 2015, that cohort starts to retire. And you can see that in this drop off in effective units of labor as the kind of population growth since the baby boom has fallen and kind of fallen back to long run kind of very low population growth. You can see that in the projections that's going to reduce the aggregate effective units of labor in the economy, and not just reduce the growth rate, but potentially further out even creates a negative drag on aggregate effective units of labor. So, to the extent that labor is like really the key input into production, that's going to kind of be a negative force on potential output. That's kind of one very direct mechanism, but there's of course other channels and a lot of empirical evidence about the other channels that potentially drive that potentially link aging to productivity and output. So there's kind of productivity. So there's evidence from I'm just kind of going to point to a few of the papers in the recent literature. There's this evidence that aging decreases GDP per capita, and actually 2/3 of that effect comes through productivity growth. So productivity per unit of labor, as opposed to just the quantity of labor available. If we think about what the potential mechanisms for that might be, there's some evidence that there's not just a decline in output growth and investment across OECD countries, but also very specifically on innovation measured as patent applications being kind of negatively related to the share of retirees in the economy. And then relatedly, there's evidence that actually is also linked to the decline in firm creation and the decline in startup rates that we see in the US, for example, being linked to this the kind of demographic trend. So this idea that the kind of high productivity middle age are this kind of supply of potential entrepreneurs and potential new firm creators, and that kind of supply has been depleted with the decline in population aging. Kind of going back to Joanna's point about like the kind of theme of this panel being what is our future already written, and what Joanna mentioned about AI. I think one of the things that we can think about, and we can kind of come back to in the Q&A session, is this is all backward-looking empirical evidence. To what extent do we think this is inevitable? And this is a deep relationship between age and productivity, or is it just the way our economies are set up, and we just need to create channels for younger cohorts, older cohorts to kind of be innovators, start firms, and then moving to this other side of aging, which is the kind of increase in net wealth of the oldest cohorts. We can do something very similar in terms of just take this net wealth profile as given, aggregate it up using the kind of changing shares of each cohort in the population, and get this, again, synthetic measure of wealth to income. And what you can see, again, you can kind of see some wiggling around, particularly because of the baby boom, but there's this really, really strong upward trend in the wealth to income. So as we have more and more high wealth retirees and older cohorts, you can see that leads to this increase in aggregate wealth to income. And so the kind of flip side of that reduction in labor is that we become kind of more capital intensive and have more wealth in the economy. And there's a kind of desire to hold more assets in the economy. And then taking that to kind of the equilibrium idea of that, and to Marian's point about the neutral interest rate. So you might have seen a lot of kind of talk about the fact that demographics is pushing down on the long run neutral interest rate. And this is exactly what that means, is when we think about these long run neutral interest rates, what we're thinking about is the interest rate that equilibrates with the capital market. So we have the wealth supply from households, and we have the capital demanded by firms, and this kind of our long run neutral interest rate is the price that equilibrates that market. And then that increase in wealth to income that we saw coming just purely from the demographic factor and this kind of aging population is essentially an outward shift of that wealth supply. And so all else equal, households desire more wealth and desire to hold higher wealth to income, and in equilibrium, that's going to push down the price to encourage firms to hold that wealth and kind of demand that capital. I sort of talked about wealth, capital, assets, more or less interchangeably, and you can kind of think about the same mechanism also applying to other assets. So, for example, with housing, to the extent that households use housing as a store of wealth to finance retirement, that increased desire to hold wealth also is going to translate into higher demand for housing, higher desire to hold housing as a store of wealth, and that's going to shove also on the price of housing. Relatedly, sort of again talking synonymously between risky assets and risk-free assets, there is also some evidence that older veterans, retirees tend to hold less risky assets or have less desire or can hold bonds over stocks and so on. And therefore that actually lowers the aggregate risk appetite. So population aging would lower the aggregate risk appetite in the economy and push up on the risk premium that's charged between risky and risky assets. And again, there's some evidence of that. And then lastly, going back to Jemana's first chart, aging is a global phenomenon. And so what happens when we think about a country like the UK, which is has open capital markets, trades capital globally. And if you think about global capital markets, that sort of demand and supply is actually happening on a global scale. And so it really matters what the kind of aggregate aging of the participants of this global capital market is what really matters. And what we see then is the different speeds of aging across different countries is going to imply capital flows. And typically capital is going to flow from the older countries that have more wealth from the household into the relatively younger countries that have less of it. So that's kind of it for my presentation, and we can go back to, depending on how we take the time, go back to the poll question and see what you guys have said. So okay, that's quite a stark sort of favor in like this is proportion against potential medical expenses and care expenses and some to some extent some behavioral factors, which is interesting actually. And so I think the idea of this poll, I mean, it speaks a little bit to the next two presentations as well. But the idea of this poll is to say that what I've shown you is sort of really everything, thinking about everything given this path that we see and this kind of existing profiles of labour income and in particular in this case wealth. But these are not necessarily, baked in and deep kind of reasons for what we observed so far in the data. And there are policies that we can use to potentially change that going forward and therefore change these kind of economic implications of aging going forward. So, for example, if there is more social security and social provision of this kind of proportionally saving channel might be less needed, and therefore you would see maybe more saving during retirement and a downward pressure on that well-being.